When you go into the implementation, or to be more precise, the non-implementation of the legal framework, and when you go into some of the practices and the informal mechanisms that are in place, then you realize that actually human rights defenders are facing a very, very grave situation on the ground.
Hello and welcome to The Human Rights Defender, a podcast series in which we'll explore the work and lives of brave individuals standing up for our human rights. My name's Philip Merrill. I'm Communications Officer at Civil Rights Defenders, an international human rights organisation. And in this opening season, we'll be taking a closer look at the Western Balkans and Turkey, regions in which democracy and the rule of law have come under growing strain in recent years. In episode 3, we'll be speaking to a guest whose story slightly differs from our previous sessions. Namely, Biljana Kotevska from the European Policy Institute Skopje tackles human rights and the institutions mandated to protect them as a researcher, and not necessarily from the figurative front lines. This, however, should in no way take away from her title as a human rights defender, for she has called out governments of her home country and demanded accountability each and every time they have overstepped the mark. Which leads me to the second point. Civil society in North Macedonia is largely credited with successfully toppling the decade-long authoritarian rule of former Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski and contributing to democratic reforms in 2017. Quite how they got along with these reforms, we'll hear from Biljana herself. Biljana, thank you for joining us. While speaking, we're still very much in the midst of the COVID pandemic. How satisfied are you with the government's handling of it?
I don't think that any human rights defender is ever satisfied with the work that their government does. But of course, that there are usually situations in which we can be more or less critical over what is happening. What has made this situation very specific and very difficult for human rights defenders is the great unknown that this virus has posed. So usually most of the international human rights law and human rights standards are tied to assessing specific criteria. For example, whether the measures have been proportional, whether they have been targeted well, whether they will achieve the aim. But these are all criteria which are tied to us actually knowing what will result in a good way and what will result in not such a good way. So we can get an idea of what the outcome will be. That wasn't the case with the COVID situation. There were so many unknowns that we literally, in relation to some of the measures at the beginning, were not able to say whether that measure is proportional, whether it is adequate, and so on. So that has made our work very difficult, in this sense. However, there are some stable criteria which do not change. So it doesn't matter what the situation is. Even in war, even in significantly deteriorated situation, some things have to remain permanent, and that is the principle of equality and non-discrimination. And what we have seen are some measures which go counter to this principle. For example, in almost all of the Balkan countries, you had specific freedom of movement restrictions for certain age groups. It is a very big question mark whether these were justified, whether these were proportional, and whether there was no alternative through which we could have accomplished the same aim. Then some of the other measures, such as, for example, the reorganization of the operation of the medical system, it is also questionable, and we will have to see all of the details because now we do not know these. So we will have to see all of the details in order to see whether some of the restrictions of the right to health, which includes access to health care, whether these have been properly dealt with. For example, a big issue in assessing the human rights situation in relation to COVID in Macedonia is that while we have daily press conferences, and while this has been a much welcomed addition in terms of transparency and a very good practice, we don't know many of the details of why these measures were adopted, why at that time, why those specific groups. And these are all important information that we need to know from a human rights perspective.
Backtracking a bit, can you give us an overview of the general human rights situation in North Macedonia and the environment in which HRDs work and operate in? Particularly, let's say, over the past 3 years since you had a change in government and democratic reforms were introduced.
Well, as you mentioned, maybe the last thing which you mentioned, the last part of your question is the key one. So the situation in the country has changed greatly in the last 2-3 years. There was a change in government, which was the previous government was in place for over 10 years. The main ruling political party was in place for 10 years. And following the change in government, there was a significant improvement in the climate. So in the climate for work of civil society organizations. And also significant improvement for human rights defenders in general. Some of the maybe more important aspects would be in removing the use of the system as an oppression tool for basically installing fear, trying to install fear among human rights defenders. For example, by financial inspection. That was one of the last things which the previous government did. It opened a large financial investigation of many organizations working with human rights, and it literally subjected the organizations to a period of spending resources, spending human potential, not to say at a great cost of mental health for the persons working in these organizations, because these financial inspections happened at a time when there was an openly stated, how should I say this, an action against civil society organizations. And to be even more specific, the target was organizations supported by Soros. So many organizations were subjected to financial investigation, which ended only recently. That has placed significant burden on them and on their functioning. However, I would again emphasize that this is something which has remained from the previous government. And another thing which has changed since is that the situation in relation to freedom of expression has been much better, although it is still not satisfactory, but it has definitely improved. But we still have situations such as reporting significant pressure from persons in high political places or persons which own important companies or businesses. So this is still the case. Women human rights defenders that work in journalism, especially in investigative journalism, have faced sexual violence threats, rape threats, again, in relation to high political officials. So if one looks at the human rights, if one starts to look at the details of the situation in the ground, while the general situation, and especially in relation to the laws, may be favorable, when you go into the implementation, or to be more precise, the non-implementation of the legal framework, and when you go into some of the practices and the informal mechanisms that are in place, then you realize that actually human rights defenders are facing a very, very grave situation on the ground. And the situation gets more difficult in depending on which human rights defender is concerned in the specific situation or is directly targeted or engaged. For example, the field, but also their personal characteristics. So, for example, we had in the research which we in the European Policy Institute did with civil rights defenders, which is on human rights defenders in the Western Balkans. In the case of Macedonia, in the research, we had persons that work with trans rights, including a trans right activist who is a trans woman herself, reporting that when they approached the police in order to report violence against them, that they were literally thrown out of the police. Now, while your reporting in the police will not result in a case being opened and so on, because we have this general rule of law issue, but maybe other human rights defenders would not have been thrown away. They would at least have the possibility to file their case to the police. That is not the case still for trans persons. So in that sense, it does matter which issue you work on, but it also matters who is the person working on the issue. In relation to the topic, yes, we noted a great difference in relation to persons that work with women, for example, and persons that work with LGBT, that they have reported that they have been, the violations which they reported showed that there is a very particular thread of very particular characteristics to the violations. And they include, as I mentioned, not being taken seriously by the institutions, and sometimes the institutions not even recording the violations which they have been reporting. So while there are some general challenges, and many of these challenges are tied to the general lack of rule of law, there are some specific challenges, and particularly for women human rights defenders.
So talk us through what changed since 2017. Civil society in the region is so often on the defensive, right? Desperately fighting for recognition against the vast resources and mechanisms of an oppressive state. Yet, the democratic changes in 2017 in North Macedonia seem to have been a small but vital success for the civil society there. Is this a fair assessment?
In order to answer that, I think that we will need to agree on what we consider a success. If it was to stop an oppressive system which was in place, to uncover a captured state, and to remove from government persons that were abusing the power and that were using that power to abuse others, then in that sense, it was definitely a success. I think that only persons that were not active or following, or I would say only persons that chose not to see the violations that were taking place during the previous government's rule, I think that those are the only persons that can claim that what changed in 2017 has no element of success in it. How much of it was it a success? Whether some things could have been done differently? That is something which friends and I are constantly discussing, and we are reflecting on that every day. Of course, that there are moments when the current government does something and when we are very frustrated and upset by what is done, it goes through our head like it was not supposed to be this way, like after the change. But what we should keep in mind is that we are still facing with a captured state. Maybe the government which is in place is not the one which has captured the state, but that situation is a fact that it still exists. And I have to admit that some of the wounds are still very fresh. I mean, it was just 3 years ago that the financial inspections were in place, that some new measures in relation to protests were introduced, such as rubber bullets. You know, it's still, I mean, it was 5 years ago already. It is still fresh, like on the 5th of May, the protest in front of the government. And when we were surrounded from all of the sides and all of this and all of the other protests and the climate, it is still too fresh in order for me to forget how oppressive the climate was.
Now, one key piece of legislation, which is said to have really disappointed civil society in North Macedonia, is the anti-discrimination law. This was a long-awaited law. It was a campaign pledge by the ruling party. It was brought forward by them to the parliament. It had widespread support of human rights organizations, various civil society groups, equality groups, and so on. It also had substantial international support. And then, all of a sudden, a few months ago, out of nowhere, through some political trickery or manipulation, or call it what you call it, it was repealed. These are sort of examples that you say contribute to this losing of faith in that government and a lack of enthusiasm that, let's say, accompanied the democratic reforms at the beginning.
Well, that is actually a very good example of what I mentioned before. So you really hit the spot, because some of the things that were said before the government change were that we are going to build, that was even one of the slogans of the government, one society for all. I guess what was needed then was a footnote explaining who all is, because apparently that we still cannot agree that we are all equal, because someone apparently still works towards having a society in which persons which do not fit within the heteronormative framework, that they are equal with others. I think that was at the forefront of what happened with the anti-discrimination law. It was also a very clear example of how politics works, in the sense of political parties have literally used the system, and they have not fulfilled the promises that they have made, both to civil society and to the international community. What they have literally done is that they have formally adopted the law and then made it vulnerable in front of the Constitutional Court. I do not accept that they did not knew that this is going to happen, because everything points in the way that they should have been aware and that they should have known, especially the persons in the assembly. So in the parliament. So it definitely gives a bitter taste, and maybe a bitter taste is an understatement. It would be more precise to say that it has made a lot of people angry, including myself, because it has reversed the level of protection even before the old law that we had in 2010. We criticized that law because it had very negative aspects, and it didn't provide efficient protection. It excluded persons and so on. But it was much better than having no law, which is what we currently have. I think that it will be an uphill battle again. It will very much depend on who wins the elections. One of the main political parties has been openly obstructing any anti-discrimination piece of legislation, and pieces of legislation which contain sexual orientation and gender identity. Other political actors have stated that they are very much in support of the cause and of equality in the country and of that particular law. But we have seen in the ground, as was the case with the law, that they actually haven't followed through and that they haven't fulfilled. They do not walk the walk. They just talk the talk, to put it simply. So while I have to hope, because, I mean, we have to hope and we have to work on ground in order for this to happen, I can't say that I have too much faith in the political actors, not especially after what happened. And the faith that we have, maybe the element of faith which remains, is that it is known that this is a crucial piece of legislation for European Union accession. So in this sense, the country absolutely cannot progress if it does not adopt a comprehensive anti-discrimination law. And all of the political actors know this. It's just a matter of what type of a legislation they will adopt, because we are looking at the possibility of having again another law like the one that we had in 2010. While what we managed to do through the work of a very dedicated working group with the 2019 law was to actually adopt a very progressive law, one which was capable of serving many generations, unlike the types of legislation which are usually adopted. As you might be aware, you adopt a legislation and then you amend it the next year and then the next year and the next year. This was a quite promising piece of legislation, but we will see whether the text will be adopted as it was, whether it will be improved, or whether it will be just a vague picture of what it was.
Now, given the sort of country that you describe that you grew up in, and generally the relatively precarious role faced by human rights defenders anywhere across the world, we've spoken to several colleagues of yours in this region throughout this series, and we've heard a lot about the threats and attacks and intimidations that are faced by HRDs. What was your personal motivation? What was your inner drive to commit and to dedicate your life to this cause?
I have to say that as someone working on human rights research, I have been privileged enough and fortunate enough to not be even close to being subjected to that much hate speech and violence and threats of violence as some of my colleagues have. But of course that the threats are there. And of course that on a very much personal level, you do feel the weight of the work that you do, by the way that you're perceived from society, even by the way that you're perceived in a closer circle in which you live and work. But as a personal motivation, I mean, personally for me, it started, I guess, as just a curiosity of someone that couldn't explain what was happening in her country in the 90s, because I was very little when the wars in Yugoslavia started. And then I didn't even knew that this was an issue which bothered me, actually. But I took, before starting law school, many years ago, I took a summer course or summer university in Novi Sad, next stop, I think it was called. And I took a course in human rights. And at the course, we opened a lot of topics, including in relation to the wars and to the refugees. And I think that until that point, at that point, I realized how I thought that I knew of the violations that took place during the war, but I was amazed at all of the things that I heard there. And ever since, I sort of got even more curious, and furthermore, even more irritated, and driven to do more in terms of changing laws, for example, because as you study through law school, you see all of these things which do not necessarily work in favor of human rights, and you sort of have the desire not to implement these laws, but to change them. So I think that is how I ended up working in think tanks and in research ever since. But the ultimate drive, I guess, is equality, because I also work on equality, and I believe that this should be a world where everyone will be treated equally, where everyone will be able to enjoy their rights on an equal basis. And if we need to invest additional resources to achieve this, then we should. If we need to do some accommodation measures, then we also should. So we have to do whatever we can in order to enable every individual to fulfill their full potential, regardless of their personal characteristics or status. So I cannot deny a personal motivation in the sense of living through the transition period also. So I did face, and my family did face that shock with a lot of enterprises being closed, and personally in our family, one of my parents not receiving a salary for very extended periods of time. So at that point I was still young, and I was just wondering, why is this happening? Because before that, having enough food was not an issue, having enough money was not an issue. So then all of these social justice things, which I have to admit that until while I was in high school and until I came to law school, I wasn't even thinking thinking about them. But they especially came to me, and I started reflecting more and more as I progressed with the education. So, and as I met more and more people, and as I got involved in civil society, and then I just realized that this is a never-ending battle. And I thought that it is one which is worth fighting.
Now, your career took a very interesting turn thereafter. As I understand, you completed your doctoral studies at Queen's University in Belfast, and your work looked at the history of equality and non-discrimination in the former Yugoslavia through an intersectional lens. Now, what I'm really interested in is when you look at Northern Ireland and the Western Balkans, both, of course, post-conflict societies, and Northern Ireland, particularly over the past year or two, given the whole Brexit saga, experiencing increased tensions. When you look at these two regions, how do they compare? Are there lessons that you feel societies in each can learn from one another?
Well, I would say that, I often joke that I felt very much at home in Northern Ireland because we have so many. It is really even funny when you start to think of all of the similar things which we have. At a point, even there were even very similar policies being adopted by the government in Macedonia and the one in Northern Ireland, and for the same populistic purpose. So that was in relation to these wooden pellets. So it was supposed to lead towards energy efficiency and so on. So that was adopted in Macedonia while I was doing fieldwork in the Balkans. And when I went back to Northern Ireland, I actually realized that the policy has been adopted there as well. But in Northern Ireland, the way that it was implemented, it resulted in spending the 4-year budget in 2 months. 2 or 3 months it was. So it was really, it was a complete mess. And also other things happened which were very similar at the same time. In Macedonia, the whole discussion around the use of the Albanian language was happening while we were in Northern Ireland, and they were preparing for the next elections where the use of the Irish language was the main topic. And all of the posters on the street where we lived and in the neighborhood were literally written in Irish language and demanding for equal status of the Irish language. Also, at the same time, the society was grappling with forming a government. You might remember there was a few months, I think it was 6 or so months, where we didn't have a government. At about the same time, the same thing happened in Northern Ireland. It's just that they still, in a way, do not have a functioning government. So a lot of similarities. And it was very interesting to learn from their experiences in the sense of how they implemented the same principles differently. For example, the principle of just and equitable representation. It was my impression from what I had learned that it was done more gradually in Northern Ireland than it was done in Macedonia. But it was also what I saw in Northern Ireland, and maybe this was just my impression as an outsider, but what I saw, in talking with just everyday people, of course not with my colleagues at the university, was this determination that they will never go back to the situation before the Good Friday. And everyone would always say, like, it doesn't matter how bad it is now, and especially in terms of political elites using the ethnic issue for political aims, which is also another similarity. They would always say, no matter how things are bad now, we just cannot go back to where we were before. But we have to understand that what they faced was checkpoints throughout the whole city, very restricted movement, more bombing. So it was very, very different to what we experienced in Macedonia. So this strong determination is definitely different. But as I mentioned, the games of the political elites are very, very similar. So it felt at home.
So back at home, in December 2019, civil rights defenders released the Effectiveness of National Human Rights Institutions in the Western Balkans report. This was significantly contributed to by the European Policy Institute in Skopje, and you worked on it quite heavily as well. Can I ask, what were your key findings from the report, and how did they reflect the human rights situation in general in the countries that were researched, that were studied?
Well, all of the topics that we talked until now actually are somehow connected to national human rights institutions and to the issues that we identified in that report. So The first issue, which was noticeable throughout the whole region, was lack of political will to establish independent national human rights institutions. When I say the whole region, I mean Montenegro, Serbia, and Macedonia, because we are just working on the research for Albania, Bosnia, and Kosovo this year. So the lack of political will is missing to establish such independent institutions. We have seen maybe formal processes which get to a point, but then you have a lot of informal procedures and non-transparent parts of the procedure where eventually persons which are not the most qualified or persons which have significant political affiliation to the ruling political parties end up being elected as members in these national human rights institutions, which directly undermines the potential for independence. Then you also have other types of pressure over the institutions, even where you have independent institutions or institutions which decided to act independently. We had registered cases of blocking of the work of the institution. So the institution will try to do something or to raise an issue higher, but they can be blocked on many levels. For example, being completely financially dependent for the budget on the state, and having procedures which basically do not allow the institutions to propose the budget, and for the parliament to have an obligation to say yes to whatever the institution proposed, creates significant issues. Institutions have to ask very often, and in the case of Macedonia, yes, they have to ask for consent from the government for employment. So that is one of the ways in which the government can exercise pressure, because they will just not approve employment for extended periods of times, which leaves the institution without human resources in order for it to be able to do its work. You also, if you cut down finances, then you don't give the institution enough resources in order to be able to exercise its full mandate. This has been a constant feature throughout the region and in Macedonia. But there are also some things which depend on the persons which work in the institutions, such as socialization, learning and growing, and cooperation. It has been really staggering to notice throughout the region the very low level of cooperation of national human rights institutions among themselves. So, for example, the ombudsperson in Macedonia not cooperating with the equality body, the Commission for Protection Against Discrimination at that time. Also, there is the cooperation with civil society organizations is more often than not very superficial. Again, I'm talking now about the case of Macedonia. So the ombudsperson will come to events organized by civil society organizations. The commission will maybe, or the equality body will maybe accept to be a partner on a project. But this is not a cooperation, a way in which two partners which see themselves as with a potential and need or want to cooperate. This is not the way that they would position themselves. So there is no initiative on parts of the national human rights institutions. This is not institutionalized. It very much depends on the willingness and the push from the civil society sector. So it is a really tricky situation. And then the other thing in relation to the socialization and cooperation is the way that the socialization within the international human rights community is being approached. So you can see persons from these institutions participating in many international events, for sure, but how significant, how meaningful this participation actually is. This is what we established as one of the points on which we need to do additional research, because it seems that more often than not, for some of the institutions for which we had this data, but we didn't have conclusive data in order to put this in the final report, but it was my impression that it seems that in many instances, persons from these institutions, with the exception of the Data Protection Authority in Macedonia, who seems to be really using the possibilities that it has for socialization at the international level, for the other institutions, it seems that this participation is quite formal, in the sense of, I will go to this conference and then I will take part, but I will not necessarily speak. I will not necessarily establish any contacts with anyone, which will result in something later on. So very, very questionable socialization. So I would say that these are maybe some of the main points. But what I mentioned at the beginning in relation to actually how national human rights institutions tie into all of the things that we talked until now, for example, what comes as a conclusion from both reports that we did as EPI with civil rights defenders, so the one on human rights defenders and the one on national human rights institutions, is that there is very little also cooperation among human rights defenders and national human rights institutions. Human rights institutions, even during the previous government, when the situation was most burning, the ombudsperson, especially as the institution that was supposed to come the most to raise the alarms in relation to the situation with human rights defenders, was very much silent. So the human rights defenders do not get the support that they need from national human rights institutions yet. So that is one of the issues which we identified, and we proposed having a forum, which will be like a meeting spot for national human rights institutions and human rights defenders, because they are basically working on the same issues. It's just that they are looking at them from different standing points. Or another aspect, what we mentioned with the COVID crisis, it is really questionable whether and to which extent national human rights institutions have been following, whether the measures that have been put in place are in line with international human rights law standards. And especially, I'm saying this as we saw very few reactions from these institutions. Some of the institutions were not even functional during this period. So it is really questionable what type of a contribution some of them have made during this period.
Okay, so final question, and we're trying to standardize this actually with each of the guests, and that's to leave it on a somewhat positive note. We know how stressful and how troublesome and challenging the role of being a human rights defender can be. What is often lacking is the success stories, is the positive stories that can then lead to inspire future generations and to set an example in that way. Can I ask you, what would you say would be your standout success? What would be the one example where you would look back on and say, look, here is when we contributed and here is when we made impact?
Well, the adoption of the anti-discrimination law last year was a very promising point. And it was one in which myself and other persons also had high hopes that because it carried with it potential tools, it suggested tools and procedures which we could use in order to advance equality for all. And it did include intersectional equality as well. So it included a vast array of personal characteristics and statuses, including some which have been deliberately excluded before, such as sexual orientation and gender identity. So that was a very promising point. And it felt like, okay, now we have the basics. Now we can go and do some serious work. Because there is this mismatch between the high capacity which is there in the civil society sector in relation to this topic and the underperformance which happens at the structural level. So this law would have bridged that, and we could have moved on. We could have gone forward already with the issue and with pursuing justice. But I guess that is also why the disappointment in relation to the repeal of the law was so high. I'm not very much into optimism or pessimism. I mean, I don't often position myself. I try not to position myself. Actually, maybe I do, but I try not to because it really changes on a daily level. But I don't think that any of us has any choice but to just keep on working and to do the best that we can in the type of work that we do and to support each other and then to create wide, strong coalitions that will aim for intersectional justice and just to put as much pressure on whoever sits in the government because we are all in this together. So I'm not sure whether that is optimistic or pessimistic, but that is how I feel.
Thank you, Biljana. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and insights with us. And to all listeners also, for anyone interested in national human rights institutions in the Western Balkans, I strongly recommend you visit our website and access the report which you had mentioned throughout this session, for it is a comprehensive, data-driven assessment of NHRIs in North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. And worth mentioning, over the course of the coming year, we do plan on extending this research to the remaining 3 Western Balkan countries. So do look out for this, and we'll speak soon. Bye now.